I'll now hand over to Jacqui Coombes to take you through some of the Are You Competent criteria. And Jacqui's been doing a PhD through ECU, on competence, and has submitted her thesis and has some very, very interesting outcomes in her research as to competence. So I'd like you to welcome Jacqui to this podcast.
There's quite a wide audience physically and, I suppose, from a background perspective. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm not used to presenting behind a lectern. As I've said before, it feels like I'm a priest, and I'm not qualified to be a priest. So when you take my comments, please don't take it as fire and brimstone. I'm just going to share some of my findings with you. So I'm just going to cut to the chase and get to the interesting stuff, for me anyway. Don't know about you guys. A lovely question that, isn't it? Who are competent persons? One of the issues I have with the phrase competent persons is that the meaning in our language of competent persons has changed significantly since it was introduced in 1989, when the JORC Code was first brought into the ASX listing rules. Competency. You've got to think about being a competent person and the negative of that. It's not fun being an incompetent person. And we all have people we'd like to refer to as incompetent persons. I have a few neighbours who are. Anyway, competent persons. I think we need to think sensibly on what it means to be a competent person and in what realm. So you might be competent in one area, but it doesn't necessarily qualify you to be competent in another area. So I'm going to take you into some of the research and the work I've been doing. Now, the impetus for my doing this research is I'm in the business of developing competency. I take people somewhere along the spectrum of their careers and hopefully inspire them to go further, preferably in resource estimation, because that's really fun. But it's to get them towards this target of competent persons. And it seemed very clear to me what competent persons was. I now gather that we all have a different meaning of what competent persons was. So when I started looking at that, my focus was on, in my research, the original impetus was, how do we get people? What are the best competency development programs? What are the best ways? What are the experiences that matter? What training courses matter? What sort of peer group? How do we take a person, or a geologist, say, and turn them into a competent person? Well, you can't really establish what those development programs are if your target is all over the place. It's very vague, this notion of competent person. So before I could move on to that aspect, I had to anchor what is competent person. And a very quick summary of 3 or 4 years' work is that I essentially did some interviews on some what I've called JORC Code experts. These are people who are either currently on JORC, or people who have been on JORC, or people who are in senior positions in organizations, company directors, accountants, ASIC, ASX representatives. So a cross-section of people, and try to find out from them what is a competent person beyond the standard definition of competent person in the JORC Code. I used that information to establish an online survey or questionnaire, and got a whole lot of people with a range of experience, a range of expertise, commodities, contexts, and asked them a few questions. That online survey was built from work I'd been reviewing and researching on statistical reasoning development, and used that to essentially set up a competent person's assessment tool. I had some industry reality checks, and something else I'm going to talk to you about is a Rasch analysis, which used, you've got kids who have done the NAPLAN, yeah? You're familiar with the NAPLAN? TEE, entrance, tertiary entrance, all of those processes are tested using a Rasch analysis. So I've used that sort of tool. And from that, come up with a description. I don't want to say a definition, it's a description of what a competent person is. And my description of a competent person is a mining professional who has a mature ability to reason across the JORC Code, They can provide a reasoned analysis of the risks in a project, and they're able to communicate the material risks without exclusion across a range of audiences. Does that make sense? When we're talking about Table 1 reporting, Chris emphasized earlier about how pervasive this Table 1 reporting requirement is. But what we really want to do is communicate to the investor what to watch out for. Your project doesn't have to be perfect, but you do have to communicate where the issues are. So that's my description of a competent person. But let's go back and see how I've got to that. And I want to take you back to this Rasch analysis. Can you see there the R-A-S-C-H? It's a lovely word, Rasch. Sorry, just feels good. Rasch analysis. One of the a Rasch analysis essentially tests your assessment tool, say NAPLAN or your TE, or in this case the competent person's assessment tool, tests for internal consistency. Let me explain. If a person gets a low score, then the questions they've got correct must come from easy questions. If a person gets a higher score and they're getting more difficult questions correct, they must also get the easy questions correct. Is that fair enough? It's not just about the score, it's about the consistency in that scoring mechanism. And that's used to test whether NAPLAN reflects the ability of students, school students, and it's used for tertiary entrance examination, essentially any high stakes testing, where you say people make the grade or they don't make the grade. So the Rasch analysis is essentially to test the tool. The other outcomes, and can you see it from that side there? I feel like I'm missing you. The other outcome is something called a Wright plot. This is W-R-I-G-H-T, a Wright plot after Mr. Wright, as opposed to Mr. Wrong. Sorry, little joke. So the idea is that every person gets a score, and every question in the process gets a score. The scores have the same scale, which you see there in yellow, the Logit score, ranging from -3.75 to 3.75. In the red, each person has a score, and in the blue, each question has a score. If you are testing and trying to differentiate a person's ability, your questions must span the people you're testing. It's no good having your population getting everything right, yeah, because then you're not able to differentiate. Similarly, you don't want your questions so difficult that you miss out on anybody getting anything correct. The other thing that comes out is on the far right, you see a question reference. So those are I've got the 12 questions. There are certain themes that I wanted people to pick up on. It was open-ended. The examples of the questions included some analytical questions. There were some philosophical questions. There was a range of things that related to Table 1. All the questions were cross-referenced to Table 1 of the JORC Code, so it was fairly comprehensive in terms of its coverage. And what I wanted to do is identify from this whether the test was reasonable and whether I could get a score of people's competency, or reasoning ability rather. It turns out that the lower questions, the easy questions, can you see that right at the bottom there's a 4A and there's a 1A? Right, those low scores, -3s. Those questions related to things like noting that geology is important. Okay, that's like an entrance requirement, isn't it? If you're going to do a resource estimate, you've got to recognize that geology is important. So it's a fairly low score. It's an easy one. Those questions at the bottom, when I looked at the actual questions, I would call them foundation reasoning questions. They're recognizing bias, recognizing the importance of different aspects in the JORC Code, or certainly in Table 1. Next up were the process reasoning. So these questions related to putting a particular task into action. In other words, they identified that the person could actually do a task. That's not enough for competency. What we really want are the people who are doing the assessment and the reasoning in a mining context, understanding the risk and communicating the risk. The questions above the red line corresponded to the features or the characteristics that the experts had identified as being important for competent persons. So through the Rasch analysis, I was then able to identify those people that had sufficient reasoning across the JORC Code, as opposed to those people that were still on the learning path. And I want to emphasize that's not a competent-incompetent breakdown, because incompetent is loaded. It's an emerging reasoning level. Going back to the original definition in the code, competence requires that the work is the responsibility of a suitably qualified and experienced person, subject to enforceable code of ethics, and the key criteria for competent persons are a minimum of 5 years experience, member of an organisation such as AIG or AusIMM, and in the guidelines that the person's confident to defend their estimate. Is that fair enough? There's a fairly easy criteria to meet, aren't they? Hands up if you think that's sufficient. You're a little bit mumbly, not so sure there, huh? The key word is that those are the minimum requirements. It doesn't necessarily guarantee that a person's competent or a competent person. Let's look at some of these graphs. Now, for those of you who are familiar with box and whisker plots, please give me a little bit of time to... I prefer to walk around, so this is going to be a little bit scary trying to do this behind the lectern here. Okay, so on the left-hand side, on the y-axis, we've got our measures that come out of the Rasch analysis, or what I've called the JORC Code reasoning levels. And I've split the population, or the sample, up into those people with less than 5 years experience and more than 5 years experience. On the right-hand side, it's less than 5 years resource estimation experience and more than 5 years resource estimation experience. And I should highlight that I've concentrated on competent persons for mineral resource reporting. So I'm not looking at exploration and I'm not looking at reserve competency. And you'll see that box and whisker, which essentially summarizes the range of participants or values, on the left-hand side, quite clearly, if you've got fewer than 5 years experience, you're going to have a tough time getting a high score. Can you see that? It's fairly low. It's below the red line. On the right-hand side, there's an improvement if you've got 5 years relevant experience. In this case, the relevant experience is resource estimation. And that's statistically significantly different. It doesn't guarantee that a person has the JORC Code reasoning. I took the data and investigated different levels of experience, and the one that stood out was a minimum of 10 years mining industry experience. There certainly is a difference. On the left-hand side, in the blue box, you've got people with less than 10 years mining industry experience. On the right-hand side, people with more than 10 years experience. Yeah? So quite clearly, there's something changes at about 10 years experience, mining industry experience. So the mining industry experience and the 5 years relevant experience is important. The next thing to look at was the membership of a professional institute. And those boxes and the ranges of the boxes tend to overlap. No surprises there. Being a member of an institute doesn't guarantee that you can reason across the JORC Code. Yeah? However, it is a requirement for your disciplinary processes. That's why it's there, so that you have a body of people who can sanction what you do. Recently, the NI 43-101 put out a requirement that if you're a member of AusIMM, you need to be a fellow or a chartered profession to report on the Canadian Stock Exchange. So this was interesting to me to look at whether a fellow made a difference. Now, statistically, it doesn't make a difference, but if you look at the range and competency or reasoning, you'll notice that the fellows tend to be higher. Although they overlap, fellows tend to have higher reasoning. And this might be related to the requirement of 10 years mining industry experience. So essentially, we're looking at the professional institute. Membership of an institute doesn't guarantee that you can reason across the JORC Code. Fellow, maybe you've got better probability of reasoning if you're a fellow. And the one that was a little bit unusual and perhaps surprising was the chartered professional status. Shouldn't be a surprise when we reflect on this. Your chartered professional status and your RPGO status is about being a competent professional in your field. And you can be a competent geologist, but not necessarily competent in in JORC Code. We've got to remember that. This is not about whether people are competent or incompetent in their role. It's whether they're qualified to reason across the JORC Code. And chartered professional status is important for identifying your competency in your profession. It doesn't imply competency in the JORC Code. Think about riding a bicycle. You can all ride a bicycle? There's that moment where you catch your balance, and it never leaves you. You cannot ride for 10 years, be hauled over to Rottnest, hire a bike and be fine. Okay? You are competent to ride a bike. You're not necessarily competent in off-road cycling. You don't know that terrain. And what we're saying here is the JORC Code is a special case terrain. So be wary. I'm just saying to the AusIMM, AIG and professionals that the chartered professional status is important for competency and maintaining a standard of professionalism. It doesn't imply JORC Code competency. Another thing I looked at was self-assessment, and Julian, I'll speak to you later about how I got those measures, but essentially looking at how people self-assess compared to how they perform. One of the things the experts highlighted was their concern that too many people were overconfident in their ability to reason across the JORC Code. And this just highlights that that concern has substance. Yeah? I then looked at some exposure criteria, and specifically looking at, well, if you're going to be competent, I would assume you'd improve your competency with the number of times you do a task. So you're going to be more competent at riding an off-road bicycle if you practice off-road cycling. I looked at the number of estimates generated, number of commodities, reconciliation studies, and the fourth one turned out to be redundant. So here we have the scale on the left hand, on the y-axis, the same scale, people colored by their reasoning levels or literacy, and along the x-axis I've got number of estimates, number of commodities, number of reconciliations, and there's this general trend upwards with increasing application. Looking at a box and whisker plot, and the blue boxes highlight the people who have not met the criteria of 15 to 5, 15 resource models, 2 commodities, 5 reconciliation studies as a minimum. And you'll notice that the people who have not met those criteria tend to be below the critical red line. Bringing those together in terms of the proportion of people, I had about 2 out of 5 who met the criteria. Combining them, and very clearly the people who have not met 15 resource models, 2 commodities, 5 reconciliation studies, tended to have limited ability or limited readiness to reason across the JORC Code. And it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? That ability, the more you practice, the more able you are to do the task. It doesn't guarantee that you're above the red line, but not having it increases your probability of being below the red line. So then, competent person essentially has a sustained practical application that includes learning from the consequences of corrected errors. And I wish I could share the person who gave me that quote. It was in one of the interviews, that it's not so much about learning from your errors, it's about learning from the consequences of correcting your errors. And that's what reconciliation gives you, is an opportunity to fix and see improvement. So the mineral resource reporting then is 1525 criteria, 10 years mining industry experience, of which you can have 5 years concurrently served doing resource estimation experience. That sort of anchors it for my study in terms of competent persons. So on the x-axis, if I look at experience, we have people who have not met those criteria and people who have met those criteria. However, if I look at the JORC Code reasoning, there are people with high reasoning and people with low reasoning. So essentially have people either moving on the trajectory towards that competent person or just quite not getting over the bar. My research question then had to be reframed as to what is the difference in the competency development between people going towards the competency, the red dot, the anchored point, and those that are going below. In addition to the 1525 criteria, the things that emerged was that people in the top box tended to value their undergraduate studies for the scientific reasoning, for the ability to learn to investigate. It was the thinking process that was valuable. People with at least one semester of maths or statistics, some sort of basis in analytical tools. Having on-site production experience, which gave them access to reconciliation, and a stint on-site with a project that gave them the opportunity to learn from the consequences of corrected mistakes. They'd also worked on several geological styles and scenarios. It's a bit like a black and white photograph. You can't have a black and white photograph without the extremes of black and white. You need to see the contrast. So being a specialist in one field, it's only really valuable if you can see that in relation to another field. They also had good peer group learning networks and a high level of technical mentoring. Indeed, many of the participants sought out to work at specific places for access to noted experts. And the other aspect was that the courses they attended were timed with on-site support application. They just didn't go on courses for the sake of courses. The courses were timed with application. So it's very deliberate. Now, coming out of this, and I'm not going to go into detail, is a competency development model that takes account of entrance requirements, your workplace experience, training and situational learning, the mentoring, your peer group, your networks, learning networks, and the organization systems you're working under. So that's competency. The other thing I looked at was mapping the JORC system that we're living in. And today is an example of that system in existence, so the communication of how the JORC Code has changed. And there are 3 pillars. The first of these are the systems of knowing and meaning. Our JORC Code, what it means, why it's implemented, and how we interpret it. Secondly, the systems of ordering resources and power. Who gets to sign off on what? Where does the report go to? And who gets to pay for that? Who gets to critique it? Then we have the systems of rules of doing, and these are the norms, the way it actually gets implemented. The way we're going to implement our Table 1 reporting, that comes up to the systems of rules of doing. And the only way that is really reinforced is the way we sanction it. Think about parenting, and I see lots of people about the parenting age. If you don't want your child to chew gum, and every time they chew gum you ignore it, you're undermining that rule. It's about the sanction. How do you enforce your standards? And this is an area of vulnerability for our system. You see this in 4 examples that came out of the interviews. The first is institute switching. If someone is reprimanded in the AIG, for example, there's nothing to stop them taking up their AusIMM membership and reporting under the AusIMM membership. because those two systems operate separately. Secondly is the legal vulnerability. We have members of our community who are volunteers on those committees, and they've got to tread fairly carefully because they don't have the legal backing to defend their stance. Thirdly, the confidentiality, whilst it's good in terms of helping people learn where they've gone wrong, there's a constructive process, when things go significantly wrong, that confidentiality can limit the firepower of the process. And lastly, the turnaround time between a statement and when a person is reprimanded. Because we're dealing with a volunteer organisation, there's no time limit, so that can go on for months. All of these undermine our sanctioning process, and I want to thank the AIG for sharing the paper I wrote to them. It's on the website if you want to, and everyone has access to that, I believe. The AIG paper, which was submitted last year for discussion on how we undermine our own processes. So the key contributions I wanted to make to today's workshop is this concept of competency, and specifically that JORC Code competency is a special case competency. We're talking about being mature enough to reason across JORC Table 1 and communicate that to the investors and a range of other people. So chartered profession status doesn't imply JORC Code competency. Secondly, experience. Duration is insufficient. It needs to be applied experience. So if you're wanting to know whether you're competent or not, think about how many times you've actually done the task before you put your hand up. Think about the depth and breadth of your experience. Have you done enough of that sort of work? Have you gone into it with sufficient depth? And think about this reconciliation. I put that in inverted brackets because there's a reconciliation experience in anything we do. There's what we plan to do, there's the action, and there's the consequence. Reconciliation is the process of reflecting on those. So it's that relationship we need to think about. And thirdly, or lastly, our sanctioning process. We as a community need to uphold our standards. And I do want to give credit to Chris Davies. I don't know where are you, Chris? Somewhere, I hope. Chris Davies he's quite outspoken about we in the community actually reviewing what people are doing and making complaint where complaint is due. So we own the process. We need to take responsibility for it. Thank you.
That's very well done, Jacqui. Yes, some really quite startling outcomes there, particularly with regard to RPGO and CP. And look, a topic that I think that, in the not too distant future is going to get a lot of airplay, something that we need to be aware of. Effectively, this is what we were seeing in the previous code was this over-reliance on competence, so the orange circle. Transparency was being unclear and ambiguous presentation of results. Materiality had turned into something where selected information was being provided, and that's what needed to be addressed in terms of the competence bias. So what is actually required in the 2012 version of the JORC Code, not dissimilar from 2004, the name and name of their employer. A new addition is this conflict of interest for competent persons, and that the public report be based on actual documentation compiled by the competent person, and that they, as per the 2004 Code, have given their written consent to the form and context. And the new code does have an actual form to be signed and kept on the company's files. So the written consent, as I say, the form is available there at the back of the code. The onus is on the company. It's a requirement that they get that consent, but obviously the CPs need to be encouraging compliance of the companies that they're working for. And there are examples where this has not happened in recent times. Conflicts of interest is a new one. where you have to report as a CP whether you have shares or options in the company. This is a transparency thing. It's not a judgment. So just being transparent about those shares or options, or if there's any performance-based payments that are related to the announcement of exploration results, mineral resources, or reserves. So doesn't mean that your competency is going to be questioned if you do have shares in the company. Previously reported results. Now, if you've previously given your consent, the company doesn't have to get your consent to repeat those results. However, they do need to confirm in writing that no new information will challenge what you have previously consented to, and that all material assumptions remain the same effectively and have not materially changed. You have, as a competent person, you do have the right to challenge situations where you believe changes have occurred, and that's important that you do. As Jacqui had said, you're a member of AusIMM or AIG or an RPO. It's no longer called an ROPO, it's a RPO now. 5 years relevant experience, not only in the style of mineralization, but also the activity that you're doing. So if it's calculating mineral resources, it needs to be relevant experience in that activity. Doesn't need to be the specific type of deposit, but you need to have similar relevant experience in that similar style of mineralization. Just a little checklist. Do you belong to the professional organization? Do you have the relevant experience? The key qualifier, of course, being relevant. And the third question, are you satisfied that you could stand up in a room like this and say that you are competent to do that task? And if you don't think so, ask someone.
Sorry, this is just a little plug from the AusIMM, in particular what used to be the monograph 23, which was the best practice guideline for competent persons. That has undergone a revision. It's now in the where you put tap facing, where they put it all into organisation, and I believe it's going to be called the monograph 30. It's looking at mineral resource and ore reserve estimation. There are components there of exploration reporting as well. It's a fairly comprehensive collection of papers from members of the industry, and John Baldwin has been the chair of the steering committee. That is being published. They're still looking for sponsors if you'd like to, or you know of a company that would like to sponsor that. Essentially, the chapters go through the process quite parallel to the AusIMM, to the JORC Code, and at the back there's a cross-mapping between the JORC Code Table 1 and the papers, so that gives you some sort of reference to work off if you're unsure. Yeah, so if you want to know more about those papers, please see me later, or if you'd like to know more about the publication or would like to sponsor, please contact Kirsty Burt at the AusIMM.